A linguistics graduate student survives a cosmic horror invasion by learning to speak the aliens' reality-warping language, but each translated word transforms her into something beyond human, making her a living bridge between dimensions that threatens to reshape consciousness itself. The first thing you need to understand about Violet Thorne is that she wasn't supposed to survive. When the stars aligned wrong on November 13th, when the boundaries between dimensions grew thin as rice paper, when things that should never have existed began seeping through the cracks in reality itself. Violet was just another graduate student working late in the linguistics department of Miskatonic University. She had no special training for cosmic horror, no ancient bloodline connecting her to eldritch powers, no mystical artifacts passed down through generations. She was 24 years old, drowning in student debt, and 3 months behind on her dissertation about debt. Languages of the ancient world. The invasion began at exactly 11:47 p.m. Violet knew this because she was staring at the clock on her computer screen, wondering if she had enough energy to transcribe one more tablet of Linear A before calling it a night. The fluorescent lights in the basement linguistics lab flickered once, twice, then died completely. In the sudden darkness, she heard something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A sound like reality itself was tearing, like the fabric of space-time was being pulled apart by invisible hands. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, and in that small circle of LED brightness, she saw them, creatures that defied every law of physics, biology, and basic sanity. They moved through the walls as if solid matter was merely a suggestion, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid shadow given malevolent consciousness. Some had too many eyes, others had no eyes at all but seemed to see everything. They spoke in languages that predated human civilization, words that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. Most people who encountered the invasion that night either died instantly or went permanently insane. The lucky ones simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but empty clothes and the lingering scent of ozone. But Violet had spent 4 years studying dead languages, training her brain to process linguistic structures that no living human had spoken. In millennia, when the creatures began their incomprehensible chanting, something in her mind clicked into place. She began to understand fragments of their alien speech. The revelation should have destroyed her sanity completely. Instead, saved her life. As the creatures swept through the university like a tide of living nightmare, Violet found herself able to parse their communications. They were searching for something, some kind of anchor point that would allow them to stabilize their presence. In our reality, they needed human consciousness to serve as a bridge between dimensions, but not just any consciousness. They needed minds that could process their language, that could serve as living translators for their cosmic intelligence. Violet realized with dawning horror that she was becoming exactly what they were looking for. Every word she understood, every phrase she decoded, was changing her brain at the molecular level. The alien language was rewriting her neural pathways, creating new connections that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. She was becoming a hybrid consciousness, part human and part something else entirely. The smart thing would have been to run. The safe thing would have been to stop listening, to shut down her mind and let madness take her rather than become their unwilling translator. But Violet had never been particularly smart about self-preservation, and she had definitely never been safe. So instead of fleeing, she hid in the linguistics lab and kept listening. She transcribed everything she could understand, filling notebook after notebook with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift on the page. The invasion lasted 7 hours. When dawn finally broke, the creatures retreated back to whatever dimension they had emerged from, but they left behind a changed world. Hundreds of people were dead or missing. Entire city blocks looked like they had been twisted inside out. And Violet Thorne walked out of that basement lab as the only person on Earth who could speak their language. At first, she tried to convince herself it had been a nightmare. She went home, showered, and attempted to return to her normal life. But normal was no longer possible. The alien words had taken root in her brain like a linguistic virus, spreading through her thoughts and dreams. She found herself thinking in their language, seeing the world through their impossible geometry. When she tried to speak English, the words felt clumsy and inadequate, like trying to describe the ocean using only the word wet. The notebooks she had filled during the invasion became her obsession. She spent days trying to decode what she had written, but the symbols seemed to shift and change every time she looked at them. Sometimes they resembled cuneiform, sometimes hieroglyphics, sometimes scripts that had never existed in human history. The only constant was that they hurt to look at. Anyone who tried to read over her shoulder would develop immediate headaches, followed by nausea, followed by a creeping sense of existential dread. Dr. Marcus Fitzgerald, her dissertation advisor, was the first to notice that something was wrong. He had been a linguistics professor for 30 years, and he had never seen anything like what Violet was producing. The symbols she drew seemed to contain meaning that existed outside normal semantic structures. They conveyed concepts that human language had no words for, emotions that human psychology couldn't process. "Violet," he said during their first meeting after the invasion, "what exactly are you working on?" She looked up from her notebook, and he saw something in her eyes that made him step back involuntarily. Her pupils were dilated, but not from drugs or illness. They were dilated as if she was trying to see something that existed in a different spectrum of light. "I'm translating," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. "They left me a message." Dr. Fitzgerald tried to read the symbols over her shoulder, but after 30 seconds, he had to excuse himself to vomit in the hallway. When he returned, pale and shaking, Violet was still writing. She hadn't seemed to notice his absence. That was when he made his first mistake. Instead of calling for help, instead of recognizing that his student was experiencing some kind of psychological break, he became curious. Dr. Fitzgerald had spent his entire career studying languages that were already dead. The possibility of discovering something completely new, something that could revolutionize the field of linguistics, was too tempting to resist. He began meeting with Violet regularly, trying to understand what she was translating. She would speak to him in a mixture of English and something else, something that made his ears ring and his hands shake. She told him about the creatures, about the invasion, about the way their language was restructuring her brain. She showed him symbols that made him dizzy, words that seemed to exist in 4 dimensions instead of 2. "They're not gone," she explained during one of their sessions. "They're just waiting. The invasion was just a test, a way to find humans who could serve as interpreters when they return." Dr. Fitzgerald documented everything, filling his own notebooks with observations about Violet's condition. He noticed that her ability to speak the alien language was growing stronger, but her grasp of English was deteriorating. She would start sentences in one language and finish them in another, creating hybrid phrases that conveyed meaning in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The second mistake came when he tried to bring in other researchers. Dr. Amanda Chen, from the psychology department, Professor Robert Hayes from neuroscience, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from anthropology. He convinced them that Violet represented a unique case study, a chance to observe the human brain, adapting to completely foreign linguistic structures. The research sessions started innocuously enough. Violet would sit in a comfortable chair, while various sensors monitored her brain activity. She would speak in the alien language while the researchers took notes and recorded everything. But as the sessions continued, something began to change. Not just in Violet, but in everyone who was exposed to her translations. Dr. Chen was the first to show symptoms. She began having vivid nightmares about creatures that existed in too many dimensions, about realities where human consciousness was just a brief flicker in an infinite cosmic darkness. She would wake up speaking words that she didn't remember learning, words that tasted like copper and made her teeth hurt. Professor Hayes started seeing patterns in his research that weren't there before. His brain scans of Violet showed neural activity that defied everything he knew about human neurology. But more disturbing was what the scans were showing about his own brain. The more time he spent listening to Violet's translations, the more his own neural pathways began to mirror hers. Dr. Walsh became obsessed with finding historical precedents for what they were observing. She spent sleepless nights in the university library, searching through ancient texts and archaeological records for any mention of similar linguistic phenomena. She found references in sources that had been dismissed as mythology, Babylonian tablets that spoke of words that remake the speaker, Egyptian hieroglyphs that warned of languages that belonged to the spaces between stars. The research team was becoming infected by their own subject of study. They were all changing, all becoming something that wasn't entirely human. And at the center of it all was Violet, growing stronger and stranger with each passing day. The transformation accelerated when Violet discovered that she could teach others to speak fragments of the alien language. It started accidentally during one of the research sessions. Dr. Chen had been struggling to understand a particular concept that Violet was trying to explain, and in frustration, Violet grabbed her hand and spoke directly into her mind. The experience was like having her consciousness temporarily rewired. For just a moment, Dr. Chen could perceive reality the way the alien creatures did. She could see the hidden dimensions that existed parallel to normal space, the places where the laws of Physics broke down and something else took over. She could feel the presence of vast intelligences that viewed human civilization the way humans viewed ant colonies. When the moment passed, Dr. Chen was left with a handful of alien words embedded in her memory like shards of glass. She could speak them, but only at a terrible cost. Each time she used the alien language, she felt a little more of her humanity slip away. The same thing happened to the other researchers. Violet began sharing fragments of her knowledge with them, teaching them individual words and phrases. She seemed to believe that she was helping them understand that knowledge was always preferable to ignorance. But each lesson left them more changed, more disconnected from their original selves. Professor Hayes was the first to crack completely. He had been trying to map the neural changes that the alien language was causing, but the act of observation was changing him faster than he could document. During one late-night session, he looked at Violet and suddenly understood what she had become. She wasn't human anymore, not really. She was something else, wearing human form. A living translator for intelligences that existed outside normal reality. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange sense of relief. He finally understood why nothing in his research made sense anymore. Human science was inadequate to comprehend what Violet had become. Only the alien language could provide the conceptual framework necessary to understand her true nature. He began speaking to Violet exclusively in the fragments of alien language he had learned. Their conversations became incomprehensible to the other researchers, filled with concepts that had no English equivalents. They talked about the nature of consciousness across multiple dimensions, about the way reality was structured in layers that most humans couldn't perceive, about the coming changes that would transform Earth into something unrecognizable. Dr. Chen tried to intervene, but it was too late. Professor Hayes had passed some kind of threshold. He could no longer function in normal human society because he could no longer think in purely human terms. The alien language had become his primary mode of thought, and English was now the foreign tongue. The research project was officially terminated when Dr. Walsh disappeared. She had been working alone in the library, trying to decode some ancient Sumerian texts that seemed to reference the alien language. Security cameras showed her sitting at her desk, writing furiously in a notebook. Then, between one frame and the next, she was gone. The only trace was her notebook, filled with symbols that seemed to move when viewed directly. Dr. Chen was the last member of the research team to maintain any semblance of sanity. She tried to write reports, to document what had happened, to warn others about the dangers of exposure to Violet's translations, but every time she tried to explain the situation in English, the words felt inadequate. The alien language had given her access to concepts that human language couldn't express, and the gap between the two was driving her slowly mad. Meanwhile, Violet continued to change. She no longer needed to eat regular food. She seemed to sustain herself on something else entirely, some kind of energy that existed in the spaces between dimensions. She rarely slept, and when she did, she spoke in her dreams, carrying on conversations with entities that existed in other realities. Her physical appearance was changing too. Her eyes had developed a strange luminescence, and her skin sometimes seemed to become translucent, revealing patterns of light that moved beneath the surface. She moved with a fluid grace that was beautiful and terrifying, as if she was no longer entirely subject to the laws of physics. The university administration tried to handle the situation quietly. They couldn't explain what had happened to the research team, and they couldn't allow Violet to continue her work. But they also couldn't simply expel her. She was technically still a student, and she hadn't committed any crimes that they could prove. The compromise was to isolate her. They gave her a private office in the basement of the linguistics building, far from any other students or faculty. She was allowed to continue her research, but she was not permitted to teach or interact with others. It was a form of academic quarantine, designed to contain whatever she had become. Violet seemed content with the arrangement. She spent her days and nights in her office, translating texts that no human had ever written. She filled notebook after notebook with alien symbols, creating what appeared to be a comprehensive dictionary of the creature's language. Sometimes she would speak to empty air, as if carrying on conversations with invisible entities. The isolation might have contained her indefinitely. But she wasn't the only one who had been changed by the invasion. Throughout the city, there were others who had been exposed to the alien language that night. Most had gone insane or died, but a few had survived with their sanity intact. They began to seek her out, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't resist. Marcus DeLuca was a security guard who had been working at the university during the invasion. He had seen the creatures, heard their impossible voices, and somehow lived to tell about it, but he hadn't told anyone who would believe him. Instead, he had carried the memory like a poisonous secret, letting it eat away at his peace of mind. When he heard rumors about the strange woman in the basement of the linguistics building, he knew he had to find her. He descended into the basement one night after his shift ended. Following the sound of alien words being spoken in a human voice, he found Violet sitting in her office, surrounded by notebooks filled with writing that hurt to look at. She looked up when he entered, and her luminous eyes seemed to see right through him. "You were there," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made his bones vibrate. "You heard them too." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Violet smiled, and for a moment, she looked almost human again. "It's been so lonely," she said. "No one else understands what we've become." She began to teach him, sharing fragments of the alien language that she had learned. With each lesson, Marcus felt his humanity slipping away, but he also felt a sense of completion. The alien words gave him access to concepts that he had never been able to express, understanding that he had never been able to achieve. Others came to Jennifer Torres, a paramedic who had responded to emergency calls during the invasion. David Kim, a journalist who had tried to cover the story but had been driven to the edge of madness by what he had witnessed. Rachel Martinez, a graduate student in philosophy who had been studying in the library when the creatures arrived. They formed a small community of survivors, united by their shared exposure to the alien language. They met regularly in Violet's office, speaking in a mixture of English and the creature's tongue. To outside observers, their conversations were incomprehensible, filled with concepts that had no human equivalents. But to the members of the group, these conversations were revelatory. They discussed the nature of reality, the structure of consciousness, the true purpose of human existence. They shared insights that could only be expressed in the alien language, understanding that transcended the limitations of human thought. As the group grew, so did their influence. They began to attract attention from outside the university. Government agencies that monitored unusual activities, religious groups that saw them as either prophets or heretics, scientists who wanted to study them, and conspiracy theorists who believed they were part of some vast cover-up. The government attention was the most dangerous. Agent Sarah Thompson from an unnamed federal agency arrived at the university with a team of specialists. They had been tracking reports of unusual linguistic phenomena ever since the invasion, and they had traced the source to Violet's research. Agent Thompson was a pragmatist. She didn't care about the academic implications of what Violet had discovered. She only cared about whether it posed a threat to national security. And from her perspective, a group of people who spoke in languages that drove others insane was definitely a threat. The confrontation came when Agent Thompson tried to shut down Violet's research and take her into federal custody, but Violet was no longer the frightened graduate student who had hidden in the linguistics lab during the invasion. She had become something else, something that couldn't be contained by normal human institutions. When Agent Thompson's team entered the basement office, they found Violet and her followers engaged in what appeared to be a ritual. They were speaking in the alien language, their voices creating harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. The symbols in their notebooks were glowing with a faint inner light, and the walls of the office appeared to be becoming transparent. Agent Thompson ordered her team to arrest everyone in the room, but as they moved forward, Violet stood up and spoke a single word in the alien language. The effect was immediate and devastating. The agents collapsed, clutching their heads as alien concepts flooded their minds. They saw visions of the creatures that had invaded months earlier, felt their consciousness being pulled into dimensions that human minds weren't designed to perceive. Only Agent Thompson remained standing, and only through sheer force of will. She drew her weapon and pointed it at Violet, but she knew it was useless. What did bullets mean to someone who existed partially in other dimensions? "You can't stop what's coming," Violet said, and her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We are the bridge between worlds. We are the translators for the new reality." Agent Thompson tried to respond, but the words died in her throat. She was looking at Violet, but she was also seeing something else, something that her mind couldn't process. The woman in front of her was changing, becoming something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The standoff ended when Violet and her followers simply vanished. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, leaving behind only their notebooks and the lingering scent of ozone. Agent Thompson and her team were found hours later, catatonic and speaking in fragments of the alien language. The government response was swift and comprehensive. The entire linguistics building was quarantined, and a cover story was created to explain the disappearances. Official reports blamed a gas leak for the hallucinations and psychological effects that witnesses had experienced. The notebooks filled with alien symbols were classified and locked away in a secure facility. But the truth couldn't be contained indefinitely. Reports began to surface of similar incidents around the world. People who spoke in languages that drove others mad, individuals who seemed to exist partially in other dimensions, groups that gathered to discuss concepts that human language couldn't express. The invasion had left behind seeds of change, and those seeds were beginning to grow. Violet and her followers had become something new, a hybrid form of consciousness that served as a bridge between human reality and something else entirely. They moved through the world like ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will, spreading their linguistic virus to others who were ready to receive it. Dr. Chen, the last surviving member of the original research team, spent her final years trying to understand what had happened. She had been changed by her exposure to the alien language, but not as completely as the others. She retained enough humanity to function in normal society, but she also carried within her the seeds of something else. She wrote extensively about her experiences, creating a secret archive of documents that detailed the true nature of the invasion and its aftermath. But she wrote in code, using symbolic systems that couldn't be easily decoded. She knew that the alien language was infectious, that anyone who fully understood it would be changed by it. Her final report, written shortly before her death, contained a warning that would never be officially acknowledged. The invasion was not an attack. It was a recruitment. They were looking for humans who could serve as translators when they return, and they are returning. The signs are everywhere for those who know how to look. The signs were indeed everywhere. Strange symbols appearing in unexpected places, people speaking in languages that had no earthly origin, reports of individuals who seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The invasion had been just the beginning of a transformation that would reshape human consciousness itself. Violet Thorne, the graduate student who had hidden in a basement lab during the invasion, had become the first ambassador to a new form of existence. She moved through the world like a living translation between realities, speaking languages that most humans couldn't comprehend and shouldn't try to understand. But she wasn't alone. Others were changing too, becoming bridges between worlds, translators for cosmic intelligences that viewed human civilization as just one small part of an infinite multiverse. They were the harbingers of a new age, the first generation of post-human consciousness. The invasion had ended, but its effects would echo through human history for generations to come. Reality itself was being rewritten, one translated word at a time, by people who had learned to speak in languages that didn't belong to any earthly civilization. And somewhere, in the spaces between dimensions, the creatures that had started it all were waiting patiently for the translation to be complete.